In a small Pennsylvania town, the ground smokes as if it's alive. Even in the dead of winter, the earth feels warm underfoot, and at night, faint orange glows seep through cracks in the pavement. The air carries a sharp, mineral smell, something ancient burning deep below, feeding on itself. It's a fire that should have been put out long ago, but it wasn't. Not because nobody tried, but because powerful men with important titles and access to secret documents decided that what was burning beneath Centralia was more valuable burning than extinguished. The official story goes that it all started with a simple trash fire in May 1962, a careless accident in an old mining pit that happened to sit right on top of one of the largest anthracite coal networks in the eastern U.S. The fire was lit, the garbage burned, and supposedly it was put out. Just a mistake. A miscalculation. The kind of thing that happens. But if you talk to the people who actually lived there, the ones who fled long before the government told them to, whose kids got sick with mysterious respiratory issues, whose homes cracked and sank while officials insisted everything was fine, you hear a very different version. They tell a story about a fire that might have been made possible by choices made years before anyone struck a match, about a company that had detailed maps showing the dump sat right on a direct path to the coal seams below, about those reports being sent to the state more than a year before the fire even started, about state officials who did nothing, or were told to do nothing, while there was still time to stop it, and about a decision, somewhere up the chain, that a town of thousands living above a growing inferno was a problem to be managed, not solved. This isn't a ghost story. There's nothing supernatural about Centralia. That's exactly what makes it so deeply, persistently disturbing. Before we go further, if you've ever felt like the ground beneath you isn't as solid as you were told, or wondered what institutions will sacrifice to protect themselves, when the truth starts burning its way to the surface, make sure you're subscribed to Liturgy of Fear. Hit the bell so you don't miss a single deep dive into America's hidden histories. And drop a comment telling us where you're watching from tonight. We read every single one. What happened in Centralia didn't begin in 1962. It started nearly a century earlier, deep in the mountains, where men went underground and learned things the earth would rather have kept secret. To understand Centralia, you have to understand what anthracite coal meant to the people of central Pennsylvania in the late 1800s. It wasn't just fuel. It was life itself, the material that built entire communities and kept them alive. Unlike softer bituminous coal, anthracite burned hotter, cleaner, and longer. It heated the brownstones of New York and the townhouses of Philadelphia. It powered the factories of the Gilded Age and fueled the industrial capitalism that reshaped America after the Civil War, and the men who controlled it became extraordinarily powerful. The region that would become Columbia County sat on one of North America's most remarkable geological formations, a massive anthracite deposit running in thick, interconnected veins through the Appalachian ridges. For generations, small mining operations had carved tunnels and shafts through the area, leaving behind a labyrinth of passages, chambers, flooded sections, and gas-filled pockets that was never fully mapped. When the big coal companies moved in after the Civil War, they inherited not just the coal, but that entire underground mess, all its connections, collapses, and poorly sealed entries. Centralia was incorporated in 1866, though settlers had been there for decades. It sat in a natural bowl between ridges, a compact grid of streets packed close together, the way coal towns always were, as if proximity itself might offer some protection against the loneliness of the mountains. By the 1870s, the Philadelphia and Reading Coal and Iron Company was already operating in the area, and the tunnel network beneath the town was growing more complex every year. The miners knew those tunnels like they knew their own homes. Which passages connected, where ceilings were low, where air went bad when it rained, which shafts had been abandoned and sealed with nothing but timber and dirt. The miners were largely immigrants: Welsh, Irish, Lithuanian, Polish, Slovak, Italian. They'd come because the companies recruited them, promising steady wages and housing. And they'd stayed because the coal had swallowed their fathers and brothers and neighbors. And because the coal region was all they knew. They built churches in Centralia, 6 denominations packed into a town that, at its peak, held around 2,000 souls. They built a school, a post office, a theater, taverns, a lunch counter, a hardware store. They built a real community with its own texture and memory, on ground that was never entirely theirs. One miner, Joseph Kudlak, who worked the Locust Run shaft from 1898 until a roof collapse took 2 of his fingers in 1911, kept a journal. In the summer of 1903, he wrote something that would later read like prophecy. The foreman tells us again today to leave the number 7 corridor sealed and ask no questions. He says the gas in there is bad. But I've been at the entrance to that tunnel, and there's no bad air I can detect. Just old coal and empty dark. And the sense that whatever's wrong in that place, the company already knows and isn't going to tell us. What Kudlak sensed, but couldn't fully articulate, was that the geological map beneath Centralia was far more dangerous than the company had ever disclosed. The veins ran not just deep but shallow, in some places less than 50 feet beneath the streets and yards, connecting to deeper seams through the old workings. The ground was full of holes, interconnected, partially sealed, partially flooded, partially filled with gases, a vast subterranean architecture that no one had ever fully mapped. For decades, that just meant living in Centralia came with a certain background unease, occasional subsidence cracking a foundation, sulfur smells rising from yards in wet weather, mine foremen who discouraged questions. People adapted. People in coal country had learned, across generations, to tolerate things that would have been unacceptable elsewhere. That was part of life there. A certain toughness, a certain silence about what was simply the condition of one's existence. And then, in the spring of 1962, someone lit a match. The official account of May 27, 1962 is almost deliberately mundane. Members of the Centralia Borough Council authorized burning the town's garbage dump, as they'd done before without issue. The dump was in an old strip mine pit at the edge of town on Langdon Street, unremarkable, like any small town dump. The fire was set, the garbage burned, and by all appearances it was put out. The council members went home. Business as usual. Over the next few days, workers noticed sections of the dump still smoldering. They doused it with water, covered it with soil. The smoldering continued. This wasn't immediately alarming. Dump fires sometimes lingered, and standard remedies usually worked within a few days. What no one on the Borough Council knew, and what the state agency responsible for mine safety almost certainly did know, was that the Langdon Street dump had been built on a location with a specific and documented risk. An engineering assessment from April 1961, more than a year before the fire, commissioned by the company holding mineral rights beneath Centralia, had identified the dump site as adjacent to, and in some places directly above, an unmapped series of old workings connected to the main seam network. The assessment noted, in careful technical language, that burning at the site should be supervised due to the risk of fire spreading to the coal seams. That assessment had been submitted to the state government. It sat in a filing cabinet in Harrisburg while the Borough Council voted to burn the dump. Nobody told the council. Nobody sent a memo, made a phone call, or posted a notice. Nobody pulled the file and said, "Wet, this location has been identified as a risk." And so the fire found the coal, not dramatically, not with an explosion, but slowly and visibly. A thin, unmapped seam along the edge of the pit caught fire, followed the seam, connected to others, and moved through the old workings. The fire spread. Coal seam fires don't roar. They don't produce visible drama that prompts immediate action. They smolder at temperatures over 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit, while the surface above looks, to the casual observer, more or less normal. They follow seams wherever they lead, through old tunnels, through complex underground geography that no surface map fully captures. And they are extraordinarily difficult to extinguish once they've established themselves, especially in a system as extensive and poorly mapped as the one beneath Centralia. In the weeks and months after the May fire, state inspectors visited the dump and noted ongoing subsurface combustion. They noted that standard suppression methods weren't working. They noted that the fire appeared to be spreading beyond the dump pit. And then, for a period that would later come under intense scrutiny, decisive action simply didn't materialize. Why? The official explanation is bureaucratic inefficiency, interagency coordination failures, budget constraints, the usual excuses. Those aren't entirely wrong, they're just incomplete. In 1962, Pennsylvania's coal industry was in decline. The great anthracite companies had largely exhausted the most accessible seams and had pivoted to protecting and monetizing what remained of their underground assets. The mineral rights beneath Centralia, the legal ownership of the coal still in the ground, were held by a corporate entity that had succeeded one of the original mining companies, now part of a larger energy conglomerate based in Philadelphia. Those rights had value, even for coal that was currently inaccessible. In an era of energy uncertainty, future extraction from those seams was worth something to the men who held them. And the value of those rights was directly affected by what happened on the surface above them. Several of the men in positions most relevant to a rapid response to the Centralia fire had professional histories, and in some cases professional relationships, that connected them to the very industry they were supposed to regulate. This wasn't unusual in Pennsylvania at the time. The revolving door between industry and regulatory agencies wasn't a secret. It was simply the established order. The way things had worked for decades in a state where coal was king and the people who ran coal were woven through government and civic life at every level. Extinguishing the fire in its early stages would have required excavating the affected area, removing the burning material, and isolating the seam entry points. Early engineering estimates put the cost between 175,000 and 400,000, significant but not catastrophic, not the kind of expense that should have been difficult to justify when the alternative was allowing a fire to spread beneath an inhabited community. The state hesitated. Federal agencies were consulted. A working group was formed. Studies were commissioned. More time passed. By 1965, 3 years after the initial fire, the underground combustion had moved well beyond the dump site. Engineers who examined the area used language like significant expansion, continued spread, and immediate intervention required. A formal assessment submitted that autumn noted that the fire fronted was threatened reached a point where it was threatening to become uncontainable if action wasn't taken within the immediate future. That report sat in a filing cabinet in Harrisburg for the better part of a year. By the time money was finally allocated for a serious suppression attempt, a trenching operation designed to cut off the fire's path, the fire had already moved around and beyond the trench before the work was completed. The first major federal intervention came in 1969. By then, The fire had been burning for 7 years, had spread through multiple seams, and had placed itself in a position where extinguishing it would have required an effort of such scale and cost that neither the state nor the federal government was prepared to commit. What had been a containable local problem in 1962 was, by 1969, a catastrophe in slow motion. The surface of Centralia was still intact. The houses still stood. The school was still open. Children still walked to church on Sunday mornings along streets that looked from above, more or less as they always had. But below the surface, in the dark, the fire was moving through the seams with the patience of something that had no need to hurry. The people of Centralia didn't know the full extent of what was moving beneath them. They would spend the next decade and a half finding out, one frightening discovery at a time. There's a tendency in retellings of the Centralia story to focus on institutional failures. Documents filed and ignored, reports produced and shelved, agencies that studied while the fire spread. That focus is warranted, but focusing on it exclusively risks losing something equally important: the texture of what it was actually like to live in Centralia during those years. The answer, in ways that are simultaneously mundane and heartbreaking, is that life in Centralia during those years was recognizable. People went to work. Children went to school. Churches held their services, their suppers, their annual fairs. Remaining storefronts stayed open as long as they could. Neighbors visited neighbors. People argued at borough council meetings about exactly the things people argue about everywhere: road maintenance, budget allocations, the particular frustrations of local governance. All of this continued with varying degrees of normalcy above a fire that was slowly making the ground they stood on uninhabitable. A teacher named Margaret Petrosky, who taught at the Centralia School from 1958 until it was consolidated with a neighboring district in 1982, gave an oral history interview in 1989. She described those years with a precision that carried the weight of long reflection. The strange thing was how ordinary most days were. You'd come in, you'd teach, the children would be there, you'd go home. And then sometimes something would happen that reminded you. A crack in the road outside that hadn't been there the week before, or the smell in the lower hallway that we couldn't get rid of, or a child coming in and telling you their mother had been sick again. And you'd think, how is this ordinary? How have we made this ordinary? But we did. People do. What Petrosky described, that accommodation of the extraordinary within the framework of the ordinary, is one of the documented psychological responses to chronic environmental threat. When people who can't immediately remove themselves from a dangerous situation develop a form of normalization that allows daily life to continue, it's not denial exactly. The residents of Centralia were acutely aware of the fire, but awareness without the ability to act on it eventually settles into a kind of background hum. So daily life continued because it had to, because the alternative was paralysis, because the children still needed to be fed, the bills still needed to be paid, and the furnace still needed to be coaxed into life on February mornings. Even if that furnace sat in a basement that was noticeably warmer than it should have been. The social life of the town during those years had a quality that survivors describe with remarkable consistency: a heightened intensity of community connection alongside a growing awareness of impermanence. People came together in churches, taverns, and each other's kitchens with an awareness, often unspoken, that what they were maintaining together was fragile in ways that communities built on solid ground didn't have to confront. Birthday parties, baptisms, Sunday dinners took on additional weight. Arguments about small things, the minor irritations that normally resolve and are forgotten. had a different quality because everyone understood at some level that the community they were arguing within might not be there in the same form much longer. Father Bernard Charney, who served as pastor of one of Centralia's Catholic parishes from 1971 through the final years of the evacuation, described those years in a memoir. "I have been present at a great many deathbeds in my ministry, and I recognize now that what I was witnessing in Centralia during those years was something structurally similar. The particular quality of time that belongs to a life that knows it is ending, where each ordinary moment carries a weight it wouldn't have in circumstances of apparent permanence. People in Centralia during those years loved their community with an unusual fierceness and fought for it with an unusual tenacity. And when they finally had to leave, the grief was of a kind I had not encountered before. Not the grief of bereavement, but the grief of a community that had been deprived of the future it should have had." By the mid-1970s, Centralia had already begun to change in ways that were difficult to quantify but impossible to miss for anyone who had known the town before. The population was declining steadily, the way of a community that has begun to sense something wrong without being able to name it precisely. Young people left after high school and didn't come back. Families who could afford to move quietly did. Storefronts on Center Street emptied one by one. The hardware store closed. The movie house closed. The lunch counter contracted its hours and then its ambitions. The fire made itself known in different ways in different parts of town. In some yards, grass had died in patches, brown ovals and otherwise green lawns. The soil beneath them warmed to the touch in December, when the ground should have been frozen hard. In some basements, a smell collected in corners and along floor joists. Sulfurous mineral, the smell of something old burning deep underground. Carbon monoxide, colorless and scentless, accumulated in enclosed spaces at concentrations that gave people headaches and slowed their thinking and made the air feel thick and wrong in ways that were hard to articulate. In at least a handful of cases documented in the record, people lost consciousness in their own homes. A physician named Dr. Raymond Selecki, who had grown up in a neighboring town and maintained a practice serving the coal region for years, began noticing patterns among his Centralia patients in the early 1970s that troubled him deeply. He documented elevated rates of respiratory illness among residents of certain blocks. Illness that didn't respond normally to standard treatment and seemed correlated with duration of residence rather than individual health history. He documented neurological symptoms consistent with chronic low-level carbon monoxide exposure fatigue, persistent headaches, cognitive dulling that patients described as a kind of ongoing mental fog, mood disturbances in people with no prior history of such symptoms. In one section of town that sat above a portion of the seam network, where the fire had been active the longest, he documented a pattern of pregnancy complications that he couldn't attribute to any cause other than the air quality in that neighborhood. Dr. Selecki submitted his findings to the Pennsylvania Department of Health in 1977. He received an acknowledgement letter. He submitted a follow-up with additional documentation in 1979. He received another acknowledgement letter. In a letter written to a colleague in March 1980, he described his frustration with striking precision. "I have come to understand that the people of this community are, in the calculus of whoever is making these decisions, an acceptable loss. Not in any policy document, nothing written explicitly, but in the pattern of what happens to every request for action. It is studied. The study generates recommendations. The recommendations generate further study. And the families living above the fire breathe the air and wait for something to change." The story of Walter Gasparetti gives that abstraction a particular human face. Walter had been born in Centralia in 1931, the son of an Italian immigrant miner who had come to the coal region before the First World War and never left. He'd grown up in the town, married a woman named Rose Brennan, whose people had been in the valley since the 1880s, and spent his working life as a plumber serving the local community. He knew the town the way you can only know a place you've inhabited across a lifetime. Every house, every basement, every furnace that needed coaxing in February. He was, by any measure, a man who understood his environment. In 1973, Walter noticed his basement was warmer than it should be. Not alarmingly at first, but distinctly, persistently warmer in a way that didn't respond to any obvious mechanical explanation. He installed a carbon monoxide detector on the advice of a neighbor who worked with the mine rescue service and had begun telling people quietly to take precautions. The detector triggered on several occasions in the early morning hours when the house was closed up. Walter went to the borough council. He wrote to the state office in Bloomsburg. He sent a letter to the Department of Environmental Resources in Harrisburg. He was told the situation was being monitored. He was told his readings were within parameters under review. He was told, in the bureaucratic language designed to convey attentiveness while committing to nothing, that the appropriate agencies were aware of his concerns. In the winter of 1976, Rose Gasparetti found her husband on the floor of his basement unresponsive. He'd gone down to check on a pipe. When help arrived and the basement was ventilated and measurements were taken, the carbon monoxide concentration was found to be approximately 3 times the level that the state's own standards classified as immediately dangerous to human life. Walter survived. The damage to his heart and lungs was not reversible. When Rose testified before a state legislative committee in 1983, 7 years later, by which point the evacuation was well underway, she brought the letters. She had kept every letter Walter had written to every agency and every form response those agencies had sent back. She spread the papers on the table in front of the committee members. Years of correspondence, a documentary record of a man who had tried every channel available to him to communicate that something was wrong beneath his home, and who had received, in return, a succession of letters that acknowledged his concern without acting on it. He knew, she said quietly. He knew for years before it nearly killed him. Every person he contacted, every official, every agency. They knew, too. What I want answered is not why the fire is still burning. What I want answered is why they let it burn. The committee received her testimony. A report was issued. Recommendations were made. The fire continued to burn. By 1981, the fire had been burning for nearly 2 decades. The state had acknowledged its existence, had attempted several suppression operations that the fire had circumvented, had commissioned studies and formed committees and allocated funds that were spent without producing the outcome they were supposed to produce. The residents who remained in Centralia had developed the particular psychology of people who live with chronic, unresolved danger, a mixture of adaptation and vigilance, of normalizing things that should not be normal. And then, on the morning of February 14, 1981, the fire introduced itself in a way that could not be explained away or filed in a cabinet. Todd Domboski was 12 years old. He was playing in the backyard of his grandmother's house, on Locust Avenue on a cold winter morning. The ground dusted with snow. The wisps of steam rising from certain spots in the yard were a familiar sight. Residents of that block had grown accustomed to them, had stopped remarking on them, had incorporated them into their understanding of what their neighborhood looked like in winter. Todd walked across a patch of ground that looked, as far as he could tell, exactly like the ground around it. The earth gave way beneath him. A sinkhole opened without warning. The surface layer of soil, undermined and desiccated by the heat and gases rising from the fire below, simply gave way under the weight of a 12-year-old boy. The hole that opened was 4 feet across. It deepened rapidly as loose material at its edges continued to give way. The depth would later be estimated at somewhere between 50 and 150 feet. From the darkness below, carbon monoxide and heat rose in a column, immediately visible as a rush of warm, foul air against the February cold. Todd survived because his cousin Dennis was nearby and reached him immediately. Gripping his arm while Todd hung in the opening, and the earth continued to crumble around them, extending the hole outward and downward. Others arrived and helped pull him out. The exposure to the gases rising from the seam below was significant enough to require medical attention. If he'd been alone, if his cousin hadn't been close enough, if the hole had been another foot wider when Dennis grabbed for him, he would have died. The carbon monoxide levels in the gases rising from below, as measured shortly after the incident, were at concentrations that would render a person unconscious within minutes and dead within a quarter hour. The photographs of the hole circulated nationally. The image was stark and undeniable. A gap in an ordinary backyard. Steam rising from the darkness below, the edge of a snow-dusted lawn crumbling at the rim. Congressional representatives demanded briefings. Journalists, who had been covering the Centralia story for years, finally had a picture that required no explanation. A 12-year-old boy had nearly disappeared into the burning ground on Valentine's Day, and this particular photograph was one that institutions could not produce, a study group to manage. The evacuation process, which would unfold over the following decade, was set in motion by a 12-year-old boy who went outside to play on a winter morning and found that the ground where he stood was not what it appeared to be. This is one of the precise ironies of the Centralia story, that the moment of maximum visibility was also the most personal, the most human, the hardest to abstract. Not a graph of underground temperatures, not an engineering assessment. A child, a hole, a cousin close enough to grab his arm. In the spring of 1997, a doctoral candidate at Penn State, working on a dissertation about mid-century coal industry regulation, made a discovery in the state archives in Harrisburg that stopped him cold. His name was Michael Fury. He was researching the regulatory framework governing strip mining in the post-war period and had been working through a large, imperfectly organized collection of files from the Department of Mines and Mineral Industries, the predecessor agency to the Department of Environmental Resources. The collection covered decades of regulatory activity and had not been systematically reviewed since its original deposit in the archive. Near the back of one filing cabinet, misfiled under a heading for Schuylkill County, rather than Columbia County, Fury found a folder containing documents dated 1961 and 1962. Engineering assessments prepared by a consulting firm working for the corporate entity that held mineral rights to the coal seams beneath Centralia. Detailed, technical, precise. They described the underground geology of the area with a thoroughness that made clear the commissioning company had invested serious resources in understanding what lay beneath the town. One section addressed the Langdon Street dump site specifically. The language was hedged. The language of engineers who understood they were producing a document that might someday be reviewed by lawyers. But the substance was unmistakable. The dump occupied a former strip mine pit. That pit was adjacent to, and in several places directly above, a series of old workings that connected to the main seam network beneath the township. Any burning operations at this site should be conducted with specific precautions and under qualified supervision, given the risk of fire transmission to the underlying coal formations. The assessment was dated April 1961, more than a year before the fire. Fury sat in the archive reading room for a long time after he understood what he was looking at. He read through the documents again. He identified the state agency filing code on the folder, which indicated it had been received and logged by the Department of Mines and Mineral Industries. Received, logged, filed, and then, apparently, never acted upon in any way that prevented the Borough Council from authorizing the burning of that same dump site 14 months later. The Borough Council had no access to the mineral rights assessments submitted to the state agency. They were a local governing body making a routine municipal decision. They did not know that an engineering firm had told the state government more than a year before that burning at Langdon Street posed a specific and identifiable risk. They could not have known. That information was in the wrong room, in the wrong cabinet, in the wrong folder, in an archive in a city 60 miles away. Fury contacted the State Archives Administration. He contacted a historian at Bloomsburg University who had written about Centralia. He contacted a journalist at the Philadelphia Inquirer who had covered the Centralia story extensively in the 1980s. The journalist made inquiries. She contacted the Department of Environmental Resources, the State Attorney General's office, and the corporate successor to the entity that had commissioned the 1961 assessments. The response from the state was that the documents were historical materials outside any applicable statute of limitations. The response from the corporate successor was that its legal team had reviewed the matter and had no comment on historical documents. The response from the Attorney General's office was that no investigation was warranted based on the information provided. The documents were described in a sidebar article in the Inquirer in 1998. It ran on page B7. There was no follow-up investigation. There was no legislative hearing. There was no formal inquiry into how an engineering assessment identifying a specific fire risk at a specific location had been received by the state and then filed without any action to prevent the risk it described. The fire beneath Centralia was still burning when the article ran. It is still burning now. The emptying of Centralia didn't happen in the swift, decisive way of emergency evacuations. It happened the way slow catastrophes always resolve, unevenly and completely, with the people most affected carrying the weight of decisions made at a distance by institutions that would not be living with the consequences. Federal relocation funds began arriving in 1984. Following years of congressional attention and the sustained advocacy of a small group of residents who had, by that point, become practiced navigators of the machinery of government response, families began accepting buyout offers. Some left with relief, grateful for any resolution to a situation that had been unresolved for more than 2 decades. Some left with fury, the particular controlled anger of people who understood they were being compensated for something that should never have happened at all. Some held out for better terms, arguing with federal agents over property valuations in kitchens where carbon monoxide detectors had been sounding for years. And a few simply refused. Refused on principle, or from necessity, or from the profound human unwillingness to accept that the life you've built and the place where you've buried your dead is simply going to be purchased out from under you at a price set by the people responsible for the situation in the first place. A woman named Eleanor Witoshek, whose family had been in Centralia for 3 generations, refused the first 2 buyout offers and stayed on Locust Avenue until 1992. She'd raised her children in that house, buried her husband from the church 2 blocks away, worked for decades at the lunch counter that had closed when the grocery store closed, when the hardware store closed. She knew the town in the intimate, accumulated way that only long habitation makes possible. In an interview given to a Bloomsburg newspaper shortly before she finally accepted relocation, she said, "They keep telling us the town is finished. But who decided that? Who decided when we were done? It wasn't us. We didn't decide to have the dump where it was. We didn't decide how the state responded. We didn't decide any of this. We were just here. And now they want to pay us for what was ours and call it settled." Her words contained something that went beyond personal grievance, because she was right in a precise and documentable way. The people of Centralia had not decided to build a garbage dump on ground above unmapped mine workings. They had not decided to have the state in possession of an engineering assessment identifying the dump as a fire risk without acting on that assessment. They had not decided to have officials who delayed intervention through the years when the fire was still containable. These decisions had been made for them by systems and institutions operating with interests and information that the residents of Centralia did not share and were not told about. By 1992, the population had fallen below 100. By 2000, it was fewer than 20. The zip code 179027 was discontinued by the United States Postal Service in 2002, a bureaucratic confirmation that the town, for official purposes, no longer existed. Street signs were removed. Roads were torn up. Property acquired through eminent domain was left to whatever process of slow reclamation the vegetation, the elements, and the heat rising from below would perform upon it. The church where Father Cherney had ministered through the years of crisis, St. Ignatius on Wood Street, was one of the last structures to be demolished. The former congregation, scattered across multiple communities in the region, had maintained a connection to the building long after most of its members had left Centralia. When demolition finally came, people drove hours to be present, to stand on the sidewalk outside the building, where they'd been baptized and confirmed and married, and where they'd buried their dead, and watch it come down. The ground beneath them, even then, was warm. Just when we thought we understood the full picture of what happened in Centralia, just when the scale of the loss seemed to have been fully established, new questions began to surface about what the fire was still doing and what some people may have always wanted it to do. There is a question that runs beneath every account of Centralia, beneath the official histories and journalistic investigations and academic analyses, beneath all the documents that have been reviewed and all the testimonies recorded. It is a question that none of the official investigations has ever fully answered. A question that the people who lived in Centralia asked themselves, and asked the men in offices and agencies who came to meet with them and take notes and produce reports and never received a satisfying response to. The question is this: who benefited from the fire continuing to burn? To answer it, you have to think about the underground in a different way than the official story encourages. The coal seams beneath Centralia still contain substantial deposits of anthracite at the time the fire started in 1962. The most accessible seams had been worked, but deeper and more extensive deposits that the technology and economics of mid-century extraction had left in place remained. Those deposits, the mineral rights to that coal, were held by corporate entities that were, by the early 1960s, subsidiaries of larger energy conglomerates. The value of those rights was real, even for coal that was currently inaccessible. In an era when energy economics were volatile and the future of coal was uncertain, but not foreclosed, the holders of mineral rights beneath an inhabited community sat on an asset whose development was complicated by the presence of the people living above it. You can't strip mine beneath a community. You can't excavate shallow seams beneath residential neighborhoods without relocating the residents above them. The legal and political obstacles to large-scale surface disruption of an inhabited area are enormous. Eminent domain proceedings, community opposition, media attention, the full weight of a community's claim to the ground it has occupied for generations. These obstacles aren't insurmountable, but they are costly. They take time. They generate scrutiny. They produce the kind of public conflict that companies, and the officials connected to them, prefer to avoid. But a fire changes the calculus. A fire that makes the surface uninhabitable, that causes the government to declare the ground above the coal too dangerous for human presence, to buy out the residents, demolish the structures, and retire the zip code. A fire that does all of this removes the obstacles. It clears the surface. It empties the land of the legal and moral complexity that inhabited land carries. It transforms a town into a depopulated zone, where the only remaining question is the industrial one. No document has ever surfaced explicitly stating that the fire was permitted or encouraged to spread as a strategy for clearing the surface above a coal deposit. The historical record does not support a claim of deliberate arson or conscious conspiracy to that specific effect. What the historical record does support, with considerable documentation, is a pattern of decisions, each individually explicable by its own institutional logic, that had the cumulative effect of allowing the fire to grow from a containable local problem into a catastrophe that ultimately emptied an entire community. The 1961 engineering assessment filed and ignored the years of delayed intervention, during which the fire moved from the dump site into the seam network. The suppression operations that were underfunded and ultimately ineffective. The decade and a half during which families lived above the expanding fire while agencies studied and committees met and reports were issued and filed. The documents that sat in the wrong cabinet in the Harrisburg archive for 36 years. Each of these things, taken alone, can be attributed to ordinary institutional failure, bureaucratic inertia, budget constraints, the normal friction of government response to an unprecedented situation. But the pattern of them, the particular way failure, accumulated at every stage where success was still possible, and then the particular way the aftermath of that failure served certain interests very well. That pattern is harder to attribute entirely to simple incompetence. The people who built Centralia and worked the mines and raised their children above the seams did not have the power to shape that pattern. They had the power to write letters and attend hearings and testify before committees and bring their correspondence and spread it on tables in front of the men who had failed them and ask very quietly and very specifically, "Why did you let it burn?" None of those men ever gave a satisfying answer. Geologists who have modeled the Centralia fire estimate that, based on the volume of coal remaining in the affected seams and the rate of historical consumption, the fire could burn for another 100 to 250 years from today. There are children alive right now who will not live to see the Centralia fire go out. They will grow up, grow old, build lives, and the fire will still be there when they are gone, burning in the dark beneath the hills of Columbia County. Patient in the way geological processes are patient, indifferent to everything that has happened on the surface above it. The town itself is a kind of ghost, not in the supernatural sense, but in the very real, very physical sense of a place that exists in the structures of official documentation without existing on the ground. The street grid is still visible from the air. The intersections, the block patterns, the lots where houses stood before the demolition crews came. Vegetation has worked its way through old foundations. The cemetery is still there, its stones still standing above ground that is warm to the touch. where steam rises on cold mornings through the grass between grave markers. A small number of people, fewer than 10 by the most recent available counts, remain. They live under an agreement with the state, allowed to stay in their homes for the duration of their lives, after which the properties revert to Commonwealth ownership. It is, depending on your perspective, either a recognition of something that couldn't be taken from them, or the final act in a very long process of managed erasure. The last people standing on ground the state has already declared does not exist as a community. If you walk through what remains of Centralia on a cold morning, and people do walk there, drawn by the strangeness of it, by the steam rising from earth that should be frozen, by the snow-free patches on the hillsides where the heat below keeps the ground clear. You can feel the warmth through the soles of your boots. You can smell it, that mineral, ancient smell of coal burning deep and slow. The earth beneath you is alive in a way that has nothing human about it, and yet it is entirely the product of human decisions. Every degree of warmth in that ground, every wisp of steam, every crack in what used to be a road, the result of choices made by specific people in specific offices for reasons that were never fully disclosed to the people who lived above. Eleanor Wojtaszek is gone. Walter Gasparetti is gone. Dr. Raymond Selecki is gone. Harold Trezise, who filed the 1965 report that sat in a cabinet for a year, is almost certainly gone. The men who received the 1961 engineering assessment and did nothing with it are gone. The lawyers who reviewed liability exposure and advised their clients accordingly are gone. The fire remains. And somewhere in the archives of the Commonwealth, in collections no dissertation student has yet happened to look through, in files that were correctly filed and have therefore attracted no special attention, in boxes sealed when certain departments were reorganized and haven't been opened since, there may be documents that would tell us more precisely what was known and when and what was decided. Documents that would put names and dates and institutional affiliations to the pattern of decisions that turned a garbage fire into a 60-year catastrophe. We don't have those documents. We have what the record has given us: the 1961 assessment, the delayed suppression attempts, the letters Walter Gasparetti sent, and the form responses he received, Rose Gasparetti's testimony, and the pile of correspondence she laid on the table before the Legislative Committee, the sidebar on page B7 of the Philadelphia Inquirer. The children who grew up breathing the air of a town burning from below, whose health history was documented by a physician who could not get the state to investigate his findings. We have the ground itself, warm in January, steaming in winter cold, cracked in ways that tell the story of what burns below, indifferent to every administrative decision made above it. This is what Centralia shows us, that the most consequential disasters are rarely simple. They are the product of accumulated decisions made by systems that rarely face consequences for their choices, affecting communities that had no say in the decisions that shaped their fate. The fire in Centralia is geological now, beyond human intervention at any reasonable scale. But the fire's history is human, thoroughly and specifically human, and the record of it has never been fully reckoned with. What do you think? Do you believe the full truth of what happened in Centralia has ever been told? Do you think the people who made those decisions, the ones who received that assessment in 1961 and filed it, the ones who read Trezese's 1965 report and sat on it for a year, the ones who received Walter Gasparetti's letters and sent form responses, do you think any of them understood, in those moments, what they were setting in motion? Leave your comment below. We read every one, and your thoughts genuinely shape where we take these stories next. If this kind of deep historical investigation is what you came to this channel for, the stories that institutions prefer to leave buried. Subscribe to Liturgy of Fear. Hit the notification bell and share this video with someone who needs to hear it. The next story is already waiting, and the ground beneath it, as always, is warmer than it should be.